The third dinner of the autumn season at Renfield Hall was meant to be a triumph, and for the length of the soup course it was. 40 guests sat beneath the long row of candles in the great dining room, the silver catching light, the orchestra playing low in the gallery above, and at the head of the table sat the Duke of Renfield, a man no one in that county had seen smile in 3 years. Beside the sideboard, holding a tray she had not been meant to carry, stood a young woman in a plain grey gown, and her hands were not quite steady. Her name was Honora Fenwick, and the room had decided before she ever set foot in it exactly what she was. She had come to Renfield as a companion to the Dowager Duchess, a position 3 rungs beneath any guest at that table, and the Dowager had made certain everyone understood it. Honora was to stand, to fetch, to be invisible. She had learned the trick of invisibility the way the poor learn all useful tricks out of necessity. And she had learned, too, that a woman who watched while no one watched her could see a great deal. She was watching now. She was watching the footman lower a glass of wine toward the Duke's hand, and she was watching the man who had filled that glass step back into the shadow of the doorway with an expression that did not match the occasion. What she did next would cost her everything she had left, which was not much, and would give her the one thing she had stopped believing she would ever be given. If this story moves you, stay until the end, and tell me in a comment whether you would have done what she did. She did not yet know she was about to speak. Her body knew before her mind agreed. The glass reached the Duke. His gloved fingers closed around the stem. "Your Grace." The word left her louder than propriety allowed, and 40 faces turned toward the grey gown by the sideboard. "Do not drink that." Signed A. For a moment the dining room held the particular silence of a place where a rule has been broken so completely that no one yet knows how to be angry. The Duke did not lift the glass. He did not set it down. He turned his head slowly and looked at the woman who had spoken, and his eyes were the cold gray of slate after rain. The Dowager Duchess was the first to recover her voice. She sat to the Duke's right, a woman of 70 years and unbreakable certainty. Her gray hair dressed high, 3 rows of diamonds at her throat catching the candlelight as she drew breath. "Honora," she said, and the name came out flat and final. A verdict. "You forget yourself. You forget what you are." "She is a servant who has had too much wine herself, I expect," said the lady seated across the table, a Miss Cassandra Vale, the polished daughter of a baron, gowned in ice-blue silk with sapphires at her ears. She did not trouble to lower her voice. "How tiresome!" A companion who imagines herself part of the conversation. "Send her out, Your Grace, and let us forget the interruption." Honora did not move. She kept her eyes on the glass in the Duke's hand, because the glass was the only true thing in the room, and she said more quietly now, "There is something in the wine. I watched it poured. I watched the man who poured it. I would stake my place on it, and my place is all I have." The Duke of Renfield was a man who had not trusted a woman's word in 3 years, and he had reasons the county only guessed at. His wife had been dead 2 winters. The manner of her death was not discussed at his table. He looked at the grey gown, at the plain face above it, at the hands that gripped the edge of the tray as if it were the rail of a sinking ship, and something in him, some instinct older than his distrust, made him set the glass down, untasted. "Sesta Crowle, bring me the man who poured this," he said. His voice was level and low and carried to every corner of the room without rising. Now the man at the doorway was already gone. You will want to know who Honora was before she was a companion in a grey gown, and the answer is the kind of answer this country was full of in those years. She had been the only daughter of a country physician, a quiet, learned man named Dr. Fenwick, who had taught her to read Latin and to set a bone, and above all things, to recognize the smell and the look of every substance in his cabinet that could heal a body or end it. She had stood at his elbow from the age of 8. She had ground his powders and labeled his bottles, and listened to him name each one and name what it did. When he died, owing money he had never told her of, the cabinet was sold to pay the debt, and his daughter, educated far above her new station, and fit for none of the work that station offered, was sold along with everything else into the only employment a gentlewoman without fortune could take. She became a companion. She became furniture that could pour tea. The wound she carried was not poverty, though poverty pressed on her daily. The wound was a sentence her father had spoken on the last clear evening of his life, when the fever had not yet taken his sense. He had held her hand and told her she was clever, far too clever for the world she was being left to, and that her cleverness would be a burden to her, because no one would want it, and no one would believe it, and she would learn to hide it, as other women hid a limp. She had believed him. For 2 years in the dowager's service, she had hidden it well. She had let herself be furniture. And now, in one sentence spoken too loud across a candlelit table, she had undone 2 years of careful disappearing. And she did not regret it, and that frightened her more than the dowager's face. The substance in the wine she had recognized from across the room, not by sight, but by the small habit of the man who poured it, the way he had not let the decanter touch the glass, the way he had tipped a second small vial beneath the cover of his sleeve. She had seen her father's enemies do less careful work. She knew, the way she knew her own name, that the wine was wrong. The Duke had the glass carried to the still-room, and the still-room locked. He had the doors of Renfield Hall closed, and the guests protesting kept within them. And then, while the orchestra fell silent and the candles burned lower, he did a thing that astonished the room more than the accusation had. He crossed the length of the dining hall, past the dowager, past Miss Vale in her ice-blue silk, and he stopped before the woman in the gray gown, and he looked at her as though she were the only person present. "You will tell me," he said, "how you knew." The Dowager Duchess rose from her chair. "Renfield, you cannot mean to question a servant before your guests as though her word had weight. She is a companion. Whatever she imagined she saw with the eyes of a woman who has reason to want notice. Sit down, Honora, and we will speak of your dismissal in the morning." "I will speak with her now," the Duke said, and he did not look away from Honora when he said it. "And you will sit, madam, until I have done." There was a particular cost to that sentence, and Honora felt it land on her like a weight she had not asked to carry. The dowager sat. The room rearranged itself around a new and unwelcome fact that the Duke of Renfield had taken the word of a gray gown over the word of his own mother, and the room did not like it, and the room would make her pay for it. She understood all of this in the space of a breath. She answered him. "Anyway, my father was a physician," she said. "I worked at his side until he died. I know the cabinet of things that heal and the cabinet of things that do not, and I know the difference in the hand of a man who is serving wine and the hand of a man who is doing something else under the cover of serving it. I do not imagine I saw it. Your Grace, I saw it." She lifted her chin a fraction. "You may dismiss me for speaking. You may not make me unsee it." Something moved across the Duke's hard face. Gone before it could be named. He inclined his head, the smallest motion, and turned to a steward. "Find the man! Search the grounds, the stables, the road, and send for Mr. Aldous Croft, my solicitor, tonight, whatever the hour." He looked once more at Honora. "You will remain at Renfield until this is understood, not as a companion, as the one person in this house who saw the truth and said it aloud." The dowager's fan came up to the level of her eyes, and behind it her mouth was a thin line. The household of Renfield Hall woke the next morning to a changed country. The man who had poured the wine was not found that night nor the next day. The still-room test, performed by the village apothecary under the Duke's eye, confirmed what Honora had known across the length of a dining table, that the wine had held enough of a certain bitter compound to stop the heart of a strong man within the hour. The apothecary named the compound. Honora, standing at the edge of the room because she had not been told she might sit, named it half a second before he did, under her breath, and the Duke heard her, and his glance found her again. She had expected to be sent away. Instead, she was given a small room on the family floor, a fire of her own, and a place at the breakfast table that the dowager regarded as an open wound. Honora did not mistake any of it for kindness. She understood that she had become useful, and that useful and welcome were two different countries. She kept her eyes down and her wits sharp, and she watched the house the way she had once watched a sick room, for the small sign that told the truth the surface concealed. It was on the third day that she met the child. She had not known there was a child at Renfield, because the boy was kept in the nursery wing with a nurse, and brought down only when the Duke sent for him, which was seldom. His name was Thomas, and he was 4 years old, and he was the son the late Duchess had died bringing into the world. Honora found him in the long gallery on a grey afternoon, sitting alone beneath a portrait turned to face the wall. The only portrait in the gallery so turned. He was speaking very quietly to a small wooden horse, telling it a story in which no one was angry. And when he saw her, he went still the way frightened animals go. Still, she did not crouch and coo at him as the nurse did. She sat on the floor, at a small distance, which was where her own dignity had been living for 2 years. And she said, "That is a brave horse. What is his name?" The boy considered her for a long moment, deciding, "Captain," he said at last. "He is not afraid of the dark." And Honora said the captain was wise, because the dark was only the day with its candles out, and the boy looked at her as though she had said something no adult had ever troubled to say to him, and he moved an inch closer, and that was the beginning. She did not know that the Duke had come to the gallery door for some paper left in the morning room beyond, and had stopped and had stood in the shadow of the arch for a long while, watching a companion in a grey gown speak to his son, as though the boy were a person and not a problem. He did not interrupt. He did not announce himself. He watched her draw 3 sentences out of a child, who gave the world almost nothing, and he watched her do it without once looking up to see whether anyone was watching her do it, and when he walked away, his stride was not quite as even as it had been. The portrait turned to the wall was the late Duchess. He had turned it himself the morning after her burial, and had forbidden the servants to turn it back. The county did not let a scandal lie quietly. Within the week, the story had grown legs and traveled every drawing room within 20 miles, and in the traveling it changed its shape, as such stories do, until the woman who had saved the Duke's life had become, in the mouths of the curious, a scheming companion who had staged an alarm to push herself into his notice. The Dowager Duchess did nothing to correct the shape. She did, in fact, a great deal to encourage it. Honora learned the extent of it at the Marlden Assembly, to which the Duke had insisted she be brought, against every instinct she possessed, because he wished her near while the matter remained unresolved and the poisoner unfound. She stood at the edge of the assembly room in a borrowed gown the dowager had chosen to be a half-shade too plain, and she heard her name in the next alcove, and she heard Miss Vale speak it. "The physician's daughter," Cassandra said, to a circle of listening ladies, her voice pitched to Carrie. "Can you imagine? A creature who grinds powders for a living. And we are asked to believe she smelled poison across a dining hall like a hound. I think it more likely she put it there herself, and cried out to seem the heroine. These clever poor girls will do a great deal to climb. The Duke is too honorable to see it. Someone ought to protect him from her." A ripple of agreeable laughter. "She is a companion who has overreached, and she will be put back in her place before the season ends." Honora stood very still in the next alcove and let the words go through her like cold water. She had been called many things in 2 years of service. She had not before been called a poisoner. The injustice of it, that she had risked the only place she had to save a man's life, and was to be repaid by being named the very thing she had prevented, sat in her chest like a stone, and her eyes stung, and she did not let a single tear fall, because she had learned that too. She did not see the Duke standing in the doorway behind her. She did not know he had heard every word. He crossed to her through the crowd, and the crowd parted, and he stopped at her side in full view of the room. And he said, in his level carrying voice, "Miss Fenwick, will you walk with me?" It was not a question. It was a command, and she heard only the command, the way she always heard only the command, and she did not hear the thing underneath it, which was that he had placed himself between her and the room on purpose, and meant the whole assembly to see him do it. They walked the length of the gallery and out onto the terrace, where the autumn air was sharp and the stars were very clear. And for a long moment he did not speak. Then he said, "You heard what was said of you." It was not a question either. "I heard it," she said. "It is not the first unkind thing said of me, Your Grace, and it will not be the last. I am accustomed." He was quiet a moment. "You should not be accustomed to it," he said. And the words came out rougher than he had meant them. And he looked away from her toward the dark grounds as though the saying of it had cost him. The Duke of Renfield had loved his wife, and his wife had betrayed him. And that was the wound the county only guessed at. He told Honora none of it that night. He told her on a different night, a week later in the candlelit library, when she had come to return a book on the properties of plants that she had found on his shelves and had not been able to leave unread. He was at the window with a glass of plain water, the only thing he drank now, and he did not turn when she entered, and he said to the dark glass, "My wife did not die in childbed. The county believes she did. She died of a fever she took at the house of a man she had been meeting for the better part of a year, a man I had called my friend. She left a letter. I keep it still. I have not been able to burn it, and I have not been able to read it past the first line." He set the glass down. "I trusted her completely. I am told that is a flaw in a man, to trust completely. I have not done it since. You will understand then why I did not believe you at first, and why it disturbs me that I believe you now." It was the most he had said to anyone in 3 years, and he had said it to a companion in a gray gown, and Honora understood that she was holding something fragile that he had handed her without quite meaning to. She did not fill the silence with comfort. She said only, "Trusting completely is not the flaw. The flaw was hers. You gave her a true thing. That she returned a false one does not unmake the truth of what you gave." He turned then and looked at her, and for the length of a breath, the cold gray of his eyes was not cold at all. The letter lived in a locked drawer of his writing desk, folded its seal long broken, read only as far as the first line. She had seen the drawer. She would remember it. After the night in the library, the house changed around the two of them in ways that neither named the Duke, began to take his breakfast at the hour Honora took hers. He began to send for his son, not seldom, but daily, and the boy began to come down not in fear, but at a run, because the companion in the gray gown would be at the table, and the companion told the truth and was not angry. Honora taught Thomas his letters from the Book of Plants, because it was the book they had, and the Duke sat with his plain water and watched his son learn the names of leaves from the daughter of a country physician, and a thing in his chest that had been clenched for 2 winters began, very slowly, to ease. He found himself attending to where she was in a room. He could not have said when it began. He knew the sound of her step on the stair, and the particular quiet of her when she was thinking, and the way she pressed her lips together when she disagreed and was too well trained to say so. He found that he wished to make her say so. He began to ask her opinion of things merely to watch her forget, for a moment, to be careful, and to speak to him as an equal, which she did beautifully, and which no one had done in his house since his wife. Honora, for her part, had built her whole survival on not wanting things she could not have, and she felt the foundation of it shifting, and she was afraid. She was a physician's daughter without a shilling. He was a duke. The distance between them was not a distance that closed. She told herself this on the stairs, and at the table, and in her small room at night. And her body did not listen. Her body knew exactly where he was in any room they shared. Her breath caught when his sleeve brushed hers, reaching for the same page. Her pulse moved at the sound of his voice saying, her name. Her given name, which he had begun to use, Honora, lo, as though it were a word he had decided to keep. It came to a head on a gray afternoon in the long gallery before the portrait still turned to the wall. She had brought Thomas to find his father, and the boy had run ahead, and she and the Duke were left a moment, alone, in the cold light. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he lifted his hand, slowly, as a man does a thing he has argued himself out of 100 times and lost, and he brushed a strand of hair from her temple, his gloved fingers barely touching her skin, and the gallery went very quiet, and neither of them breathed. "I did not mean to do that," he said, his voice low and not entirely steady. "I know," she said. "That is the difficulty," he said. "I find I mean a great many things I did not intend to mean." His hand did not fully lower. It hovered at her jaw, not touching. And the want in it was plain, and it was want and not duty, not gratitude for a saved life, not the obligation of a master to a useful servant. "I have not wished to be near a person in a very long time. I wish to be near you, I am telling you so, because I have spent 3 years not telling the truth of what I feel, and I find I am tired of it." He lowered his hand at last. "I will say no more than that. You are in my house and dependent upon me, and I will not press an advantage of position. Yet I will not pretend either. You should know where you stand." Honora stood with her heart going hard in her throat, and the whole careful architecture of her survival in ruins around her, and she did not step back, and her not stepping back said everything her training would not let her say. If you have stayed with Honora this far, you already know the world was not going to let this be simple. The Dowager had not been idle. The Dowager Duchess of Renfield had spent a long life understanding exactly one thing perfectly, which was the machinery of rank, and she now turned that machinery against the woman she could not dislodge by ordinary means. If Honora could not be sent away as a servant, she would be removed as a threat. The Dowager had learned, through the kind of inquiry that money makes easy, the truth of Dr. Fenwick's debts, and she had learned the name of the creditor to whom the largest of them was still owed, a hard man in the city named Mr. Josiah Pell, and she had learned that Pell had a son in want of a wife with no family to object to him. She summoned the son, she paid the father, and on a cold morning in November, she arranged the whole matter as a kindness, and she presented it to the household at breakfast as a fact already settled. "I have wonderful news for Honora," the Dowager said, smiling, her diamonds at her throat, while the Duke's face went still. "Her father's debt, that shameful thing she has carried so bravely, is to be discharged in full. Mr. Pell of the city has most generously agreed to forgive every penny, and to take Honora into his own family as a wife to his son. She is to be married within the month. Is it not the most fortunate resolution? A poor companion raised at a stroke to a respectable wife with no debts and no past. I have already given my consent on her behalf, as her nearest protector in this house, and the settlements are drawn." She turned her smile upon Honora. "You will, of course, wish to thank me. A girl in your position could not hope for better, and there is nothing here to keep you. You are a companion, Honora, and companions do not become duchesses. It is past time you were put where you belong." There it was, the third time in the third place, by the same voice. Companions do not become duchesses. The first time across the dinner table, the second in the assembly through Cassandra's mouth, and now at the breakfast table as a sentence dressed up as salvation, and it landed harder than either of the others because it was true and because the law was on its side. A woman's debts were a chain, and the Dowager had bought the other end of the chain, and she was holding it out with a smile. Honora looked at the Duke, and the Duke looked at his mother, and for a moment the only sound in the room was the small wooden horse. Thomas was walking along the edge of the table, unaware that the floor had opened beneath the woman who told him the truth. Honora set down her cup. Her hand was steady now, because the worst had a way of steadying her that lesser troubles never had. She said, "I have not consented. No consent of mine has been asked. A debt of my father's is not a debt of my body. You may forgive it or call it in, madam, but you may not sell me with it." She rose. "I will not marry Mr. Pell's son. If that means I must leave Renfield with the debt still on my name, then I will leave with it. I have left places before." "With what?" the dowager said, and her smile did not move. "You have no money, no family, no character. That the county will now credit, you will leave here a woman who cried poison at a duke's table and was passed from hand to hand. Pell's son is the last door open to you, child, and I have held it. Refuse it, and there is nothing at all." It was meant to close the door, and for a moment it seemed to. Honora left the breakfast room with her spine straight, and reached her own small chamber before her legs gave way, and she sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the room that had never truly been hers, and understood that the dowager was right about the world, even while she was wrong about everything else. There was nowhere to go. A woman alone with a debt and a ruined name did not have somewhere to go. She had saved a man's life, and it had bought her this. She did not weep long. She had a thing to do that she had been turning over since the night in the library, and the dowager's cruelty had, without meaning to, freed her to do it. She had been protecting the duke's grief by leaving his wound alone. She would protect him, now, by opening it. She went to find Mr. Aldous Croft, the solicitor, who had been at Renfield a fortnight, pursuing the matter of the poisoner, and had found in the pursuit a thread that troubled him and that he had not known how to bring to the Duke. Honora had watched him hesitate at dinner 3 nights running. She had learned to read hesitation. She asked him plainly what he had found and could not say, and the old man, worn down by his own conscience, told her the man who had poured the wine had not acted alone and had not acted for himself. Croft had traced the purchase of the bitter compound to an apothecary 2 towns distant, and the apothecary's book named the buyer, and the buyer was a servant in the pay of the very Mr. Pell, whose son Honora was now to marry. The poison and the marriage were not 2 troubles. They were one. Pell had meant to remove the Duke, whose loans he held and whose death would have let him seize Renfield's encumbered acres. And when the poison failed because a physician's daughter cried out, Pell had turned to the slower instrument, a marriage that would bind him to the household and a death that would bind the only witness who could name his man. The dowager, Croft believed, did not know the whole of it. She had reached for Pell as a tool to remove Honora, and had not understood whose hand she was taking. Honora understood the whole of it in an instant, the way she understood everything, all at once and too late to be comfortable. She had the proof in Croft's ledger, and the witness in Croft himself. She had only to bring it into a room, loud enough before people enough that it could not be smoothed away. The chance came at the Renfield ball. The ball had been planned before any of it, a great event of the season, the same long dining hall thrown open and the same orchestra in the gallery, and 100 and more guests of the county filling the rooms where, weeks before, a glass of wine had nearly ended everything. The dowager had insisted it go forward. It would announce, she told the county, Honora's engagement to Mr. Pell's son, who had come down from the city for the purpose, and stood now in a too fine coat at the dowager's side. It would put the companion in her place before the whole county, and close the unpleasant chapter for good. Cassandra was there in silver, restored to her hoped-for position as the season's proper match. The Dowager Duchess sat in state with her diamonds and her fan. Every witness who had heard the accusation, who had heard the slander, who had watched the gray gown overreach, was assembled in the one room where the verdict had first been passed. Honora came down the great stair in a gown of deep green that the Duke had ordered made for her without telling her why, and the room turned to look, and she did not look away from it. She crossed to where Croft stood near the door, with his ledger, and she took the ledger from his hands, and she walked into the center of the room, and the orchestra, uncertain, let the music thin, and stop. The Dowager rose. Honora, this is not the moment for whatever you imagine you have to say. Mr. Croft, take that book from her. Renfield, control your companion. She means to make a scene of her own engagement." "I am not engaged," Honora said, and her voice in the silent hall was clear and level and carried, because she had learned the carrying of it from him. "And before this room hears another word about my place in it, this room will hear the truth of how a glass of poison came to the Duke's hand." She opened the ledger. "The man who poured it was bought. I have here the name of the apothecary who sold the compound, the date and the name of the buyer, written in the buyer's own demand. The buyer is a servant in the household of Mr. Josiah Pell, the same Mr. Pell who holds the Duke's loans, the same Pell whose son I am tonight to be married to that I might be bound silent, and the debt of my father made the chain to bind me." She lifted her eyes to the dowager. "You did not know, madam. I will say that plainly before everyone, so that no one mistakes it. You reached for a tool and did not see the hand. The tool was murder, and the marriage was its second attempt, and I will not be the silence that lets it finish. The room did not breathe. Pell's son had gone the color of tallow. Miss Vale's fan had stopped." The dowager stood with one hand on the back of her chair, and for the first time in 70 years of certainty, her face was uncertain, because the ledger was open, and Croft was nodding, and the county was looking from the diamonds to the green gown and beginning slowly to do the arithmetic. The Duke of Renfield crossed the room. He did not hurry. He crossed it the way a man crosses ground he has decided to hold, past the dowager, past Pell's blanching son, past Cassandra in her silver, and he stopped at Honora's side, and he turned to face the assembled county, and into the held silence of the room where she had been called a companion and an overreacher and a poisoner. He said the thing that ended all of it. "Miss Fenwick will be my wife." He let it stand in the silence. He did not soften it or explain it. He took the ledger gently from Honora's hands and gave it back to Croft and said, "To the room, that the magistrate was sent for, that Mr. Pell and his son would answer for what the ledger held, and that any person who wished to repeat the slander spoken against the woman beside him might do so to his face." Then he turned to Honora, in front of all of them, and he took her hand, ungloved, in his, and he said, more quietly, for her, "You told the truth when it cost you everything. I should like to spend my life in a house where the truth is told. Will you stay?" The dowager sat down. It was not a graceful motion. She sat the way a structure settles when the ground beneath it has shifted, slowly and with a small sound, and her fan lay closed in her lap, and she looked at her son, and at the woman beside him, and did not for once find anything to say. Cassandra Vale gathered her silver skirts and left the floor. The county, which had decided weeks ago exactly what Honora Fenwick was, revised its verdict in the time it took the Duke to hold her hand, because the county's verdicts had always been only the loudest guess in the room, and there was a louder truth in it now. Honora looked at the hand, holding hers ungloved, warm, and at the man who had placed himself between her and the whole world, in the very place that world had condemned her. And she did not say yes with her mouth, not at first. She said it with her hand, which turned in his and held. Then she said it aloud. Once, so that he would have it in words as well, because she had learned from him that some truths must be said aloud to be real. "I will stay." What the county talked of for a season afterward was the scandal, the magistrate, the fall of Mr. Pell, the strange swift courtship of the Duke of Renfield, and the physician's daughter, who had saved his life. What the household of Renfield Hall remembered was something quieter, and it belonged to a single gray afternoon the following winter. Snow had come early that year. It fell past the tall windows of the long gallery in slow gray curtains, and the fire in the gallery hearth had been lit against the cold. The first fire ever lit in that long, cold room, because the room was no longer a place where a portrait hung turned to the wall. The portrait of the late Duchess had been taken down and given quietly to her own family who had wanted it, and in its place the wall held nothing yet, and that was as it should be, a clean space waiting no longer a wound made into a monument. Thomas sat on the hearthrug with his wooden horse and a book of plants open beside him, naming the leaves aloud to the fire, getting most of them right. Honora stood at the window with the Duke beside her, watching the snow come down over the grounds that were hers now, too. And on the small table near the fire lay the thing she had carried out of his locked drawer, with his blessing, and not without him. The folded letter he had been able neither to read nor to burn for 2 long winters. They had read it together at last, the whole of it one evening in autumn. And having read it, they had found it had no more power to wound, and the Duke had asked her what should be done with it. And she had said that some things were meant to be let go on purpose, rather than kept by accident, and so it lay now on the table, waiting for the fire. And presently he would put it in, and presently it would be gone, and the keeping of it would be over. He took her ungloved hand in his ungloved hand, the way he did now, without thinking. And Thomas looked up from his leaves and said, the horse was not afraid of the snow. And Honora said that the horse was wise because the snow was only the world being made quiet, so that the people in the warm could hear each other. The Duke of Renfield, who had not smiled in 3 years, and now did so daily, smiled at the fire, and at his son, and at the woman who had called out across a candle-lit table and changed the course of his house. The letter went into the flames. Neither of them watched it burn. They were watching the snow. Thank you for staying with Honora until the end. If her story moved you, I would be glad to know it, in a quiet word left below, before you go back out into your own evening. The fire was warm, the snow kept falling, and the house at last was a home.